Thank you for joining us for the first of the Trees for Trash webinar series. We have Kate Bolkin with us tonight from Trees Charlotte. We're very excited about this. I love trees. We all love trees. I'm sure we have some in our yards. We've seen a bunch on the streets. And one of the hardest things that I struggle with is identification and figuring out what that tree is. And I've been trying to get better at that recently, but I know we probably all have a lot of work to do there. So Kate's gonna tell us about some of the native trees in our area, and I'm sure it's going to be wonderful. So I will turn this over to Kate Bolkin. Thank you so much for being here with us, Kate.
Yeah, thanks, Tara. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Kate. I'm the community educator at Trees Charlotte. I'm going to start sharing my screen here, and I am really excited because today I'm going to talk to you guys about some of our favorite native trees that we have, and I picked just a few that I find to be some of the most wildlife friendly trees. So that's kind of the topic of today's discussion, since I think it was fitting with the Wildlife Federation. What trees are the most wildlife friendly that we're going to see around here in Charlotte? So first, a couple things to preface before we get started. Why are native trees especially good, or why are we trying to focus more on getting native trees around Charlotte? Well, probably the two first bullets are what you first think of. Native trees have spent millions of years adapting to the climate and soil that we see. So you know that when you plant a native tree, there's going to be no guesswork as to is this tree going to do well? Can it handle the tough clay soil that we have? Can it handle our hot summers? Can it handle hurricane season? Things like that. You know that a native tree is meant for this climate and soil, and it's going to do well. Another thing is it's adapted to serve North Carolina wildlife. So the wildlife that we have here and the trees that we have here co-evolved together. So you know that you're going to get great ecosystem and wildlife services out of native trees, since they basically grew up together. And then finally, there's no risk of a native tree becoming invasive. At times we do choose to plant non-native trees, and those work out some of the time, most of the time, if enough research is done. However, there has been some instances, as we're seeing now with the Bradford pears and mimosas and other invasive species we have in Charlotte, where we thought they would be a good option, and then turned out to cause problems decades later down the road, and then it becomes a little bit too late. So you kind of have that safety net that you know that they aren't going to cause issues where we're at right now. However, something that is Trees Charlotte's mission, and something that we all need to think about, is we are planting trees in a different way than you might go into the forest and plant trees. So we're planting trees for an urban environment, and because of that, some of the native trees just don't do as well as maybe a non-native option. So the picture I have here to the right actually is a red maple, which is a super awesome tree, native tree that we have here in Charlotte. However, it's prone to a scale disease called gloomy scale. You can kind of see why it's called gloomy scale. It kind of casts this dark shadow, and that happens a lot when the tree is under stress, especially when it is planted near impervious surfaces like roads, sidewalks, driveways, things like that. So sometimes a native option, depending on where you're at, might not work. So but in general, it's always better to go native if you can. And finally, biodiversity is just as important as planting native. Planting native is awesome, but it essentially means nothing if you're planting all pines or all of the same tree. You're really going to get wildlife value to the fullest potential if we plant a diversity of trees. Not only is that good for wildlife, but it's also, I think of biodiversity almost as an insurance policy. In that if you have a different group of all different kinds of species, and say something like an emerald ash borer or some sort of disease comes in and takes out a certain species of tree, and you have a bunch of them, you're not going to have as much loss as if you only planted, say, ash trees. So really great insurance policy, and you're going to get the most out of their wildlife benefits, which I'll talk a little bit more about later.
So next, we're just gonna discuss a little bit what makes a tree good for wildlife. I get asked that a lot. Like, I want a tree that's good for wildlife. What should I pick? Really, as long as you go with any native tree or really any non-invasive tree, you're gonna have some sort of wildlife benefit. You're not really gonna find a tree that's quote unquote bad for wildlife. That's because every tree is going to filter out harmful pollutants. They're going to absorb storm water. They're going to cool the earth and the climate. They're going to have some sort of sheltering capacity for wildlife, whether that be nests for birds, hollow cavities for raccoons, like you see there. Any tree is going to have some capacity of wildlife value, which is really, really awesome. Really, the only exception to this is invasives, and that is because they often outcompete the native species that are really helpful to wildlife. And finally, some of the things that we're going to consider when we think of when a tree is good for wildlife or especially helpful to wildlife is first food. This might be one of the more obvious ones. So can the animal eat its seeds, fruit, acorns we'll talk about, and can they browse on maybe some leaves and twigs from a tree? Shelter is also really, really important. We all think of, okay, birds build their nests in trees, animals hang out in hollow cavities. But it's also important, trees are also important for animals to even hang out on. Animals that don't live in trees specifically still utilize trees. For example, lizards often climb trees to sun themselves, things like that. So to every capacity, trees are really, really great for wildlife. Even dead trees, a lot of people just think when a tree is dead, it provides no longer any ecosystem services. We don't need it anymore, but that isn't necessarily true. One of my favorite examples is trees that are dead and have fallen over in riverbanks or lake shores, things like that, makes excellent fish spawning habitat. Fish spawns often need shady and well protected areas for them to hide and to hatch from their eggs. So there are actually certain programs, I'm not sure here in North Carolina, but where I used to live, there are programs where you could actually take your old Christmas tree and throw it in the nearby lake, and it would make really great fish habitat. So even dead trees do serve a purpose for our wildlife. You have protection. Of course, animals use trees to escape predators that can't climb. They hide in them. I don't know if you can see in that lower picture there, but that's actually a gray cicada that has camouflaged to the bark of a pine tree. So trees are super helpful for that. And of course, pollination material. I don't need to tell you all about that. We love flowers, bees love flowers, butterflies, hummingbirds, all that great stuff. We wouldn't have half the food we have today without flowers. So that's, of course, very important as well. So speaking of flowers, I'll jump into the first tree that we're going to talk about today, which is the black gum, also known as the black tupelo. I wanted to start off with this one because I think it's one of the most underrated trees, but they're really common around Charlotte. The reason it's underrated is because a lot of people think they're related to sweet gums, which are the trees you probably know that have those spiky kind of fruit balls that fall off and get everywhere and get stuck to your clothes and just make life harder for us, but they are not. They just have a similar name, and they're a really great tree. They're what we consider a medium maturing tree, 30 to 50 feet tall. So it's nice because it can provide that shade, absorb a lot of pollutants and water and things like that without being too much of a monster like an oak or anything like that. And it doesn't get too wide too if space is something you're considering. It can tolerate a lot, really can tolerate really dry to really wet soils, all kinds of sun conditions. They're very hardy trees, and the scarlet fall color is just like absolutely breathtaking. They're really great for wildlife because they're actually super pollinator friendly. A lot of people think for a tree to be really good with the pollinators, you need these big, flashy, showy flowers, but that's actually not necessarily true. And we can see that with the sweet gum. They have these small, kind of discreet, hard to see flowers that are usually green or white, and they are packed with nectar. Bees absolutely love these trees, these sweet gum trees. They also have edible fruit, kind of like a red or a purplish berry that over 30 different songbirds eat, small mammals, everything from bears, raccoons, possums, mice, things like that. And deer will browse the leaves and the saplings of the sweet gum. Disclaimer, any tree you see, you can assume that a deer will probably eat it. A lot of people ask kind of what trees can I maybe keep, do deer not like, so I can keep them away. Some people ask what trees are really deer friendly. I really like them. It's going to be hard to find a deer that a tree that a deer won't eat. They'll really eat anything, especially in the winter. But overall, black gums are one of a favorite in Trees Charlotte. We have tree stores every year from October through March, and we offer these at almost every single one. So definitely get your hands on one of these if you do come to one of our tree stores. The next tree that I really like is the Eastern Red Cedar. It's evergreen. I felt compelled to add an evergreen to this presentation because really evergreens are one of the strongest trees you can get in terms of shelter. I chose the Eastern Red Cedar because they're really, really hardy and easily propagated. They pop up alongside highways, in newly naturalized area, really anywhere they can tolerate and they can survive. Even my apartment has some Eastern Red Cedars out in large pots out in front. So they can tolerate quite anything from the most extreme urban environments out into naturalized woody areas, and they just kind of pop up everywhere. So they're super, really, really great for that. They're often used as screening trees because you have that dense foliage. It blocks out sound really well. So if that may be something, if that's something you're looking for, it's a really great option. Because it has that dense foliage that remains on the trees year round, that keeps animals hidden and warm throughout the winter. It gives them a nice overwintering spot to hang out. So really that shelter value is going to be very high for Eastern Red Cedars and evergreens in general. And also we have the food that they provide. So Eastern Red Cedars have these little blue berries. I have berries in quotes because they're not actually berries, they're infused cones. If you look really closely, probably not at that picture, but next time you see one, you pick one off, you look really closely, you could see the bracts on the cones. And birds really, really like them. Over 50 different bird species and mice and squirrels and any kind of animal will eat these. And of course, the deers like to eat them in the winter because they're might be one of the only things that are alive during that winter season. I included this picture of this bird. It's called a cedar waxwing, and it was named after the Eastern Red Cedar. There are so many animals that are named after the trees that they eat or live in, and this is just kind of one of my favorite examples. And finally, the Eastern Red Cedar has bark that peels off into strips, which makes really great nesting material. Lots of birds will go ahead and utilize that when building their homes. Next, I kind of grouped these all together because, as you can imagine, they're pretty similar. They're kind of going to be all of your small maturing flowering trees. We have the serviceberry, the redbud, and the dogwood. They all get to about 15 to 30 feet tall and wide, so they're really great if you're looking for something maybe for a patio area, or you don't have a ton of room, but want something really gorgeous and ornamental. Because they are smaller trees, they are used to living in the shade, so they are quite shade tolerant, especially that redbud and the flowering dogwood too can survive shade super, super well. So I'll just go into each one of these a little bit, just kind of to describe the differences. But the first is the serviceberry. I find that the least amount of people know about this one. It's typically multi-stemmed, so kind of like the crepe myrtles that you'll see around all around town. It has multiple stems coming out from the base, and it's kind of shorter and a little bit bushier. So because of that, that's really nice because you can actually prune it to be a little bit more shrub-like if that's something maybe you're into, or you can let it grow tall and be an ornamental tree about 15 to 20 feet tall if you'd like. They have these small, delicate white flowers. It's the leftmost picture over there with the butterfly on it. And they are especially good for butterflies because, you know, as you probably know, butterflies love that white color. And also the serviceberry, it has that name for a reason. It has these really great sweet berries that are desired by birds throughout the summer, and we can actually eat them. They are edible. They're a little bit bland in flavor, but I'm sure you can add some sugar and make it into a pie or something delicious like that. But serviceberry is really, really great and would be a great addition to a butterfly garden, a butterfly highway, to maybe give that, that area some height or some dimension, something like that. Next, we have the red bud. I'm sure you've all heard of this. It has those blindingly pink flowers that everybody loves. I certainly do. And because of that, they're packed with nectar and they're really great for pollinators. A fun fact that I recently learned is it's a favorite amongst the southeastern blueberry bee, which, as you can tell by the name, is a bee that especially really is very efficient at pollinating blueberries. And I think that's really interesting because it just kind of goes to show how important incorporating native trees and native foliage into orchards and our food systems can really help benefit our food systems overall. So it's the bee really loves red buds as well as blueberries, which I thought was kind of cool. And of course, some songbirds will eat the seeds. They kind of have these seed pods. They kind of look like longer edamame in a way. They're not super popular, but they will be eaten by some birds. But overall, the pods make really great nesting material. They snap off quite easily and they fall all the time. And the last one is the dogwood. Of course, it has those stunning flowers. That's a preferred tree for butterflies. But one thing I also think is important to mention is the flowers bloom slightly later than redbud. That is why having an area with biodiversity is so important, because trees bloom at different times, they produce fruit at different times, and they're overall just very different size, shape, tolerance, things like that. But having that biodiversity is what's really important for wildlife and what can keep them around the longest. So if you have a series of trees that all bloom at different times, produce fruit at different times, the wildlife are really going to thank you for that, because it gives them a place to stay for a lot longer, as opposed to all having one type of tree. So that timing that different trees have is super important for wildlife value. And finally, dogwoods produce these little red berries by kind of later in the summer that birds and different kinds of small mammals really love. The one thing I will say about the dogwood, a lot of people don't know this, is our native flowering dogwood prefers at least partial shade. We get so many calls here at Trees Charlotte saying, my dogwood died, what happened? I mean, get a picture of it and it's planted in full sun. Our native flowering dogwood cannot actually tolerate full sun and should at least get partial shade throughout the day in order to thrive, because it has adapted to be an understory tree. So just a little helpful tip if you're thinking about getting and planting a native dogwood. We do also offer a non-native dogwood called the Kusa dogwood, which is a good option as well. It has lots of wildlife value. It can actually tolerate that full sun, and is also another good option. But of course, native is super great too if you can. And the last one I'm going to talk about is the oak group. I couldn't pick just one. There are so many good options, and they're honestly so very similar in terms of the value that they provide ecosystem-wise, economically, and wildlife value, that I just kind of decided to group it as any native oaks around Charlotte. Of course, these trees get really big. They can get really the smallest, like 40, 50 feet tall, and they can get 100+ feet tall if you let them grow long enough once they're really mature. And these sort of large tree you have is so great and so important, because the bigger the tree, the more ecosystem services it's going to provide. Larger trees can sequester more carbon, they can absorb more pollution, they can absorb more stormwater runoff, they provide more shade, they provide more wildlife habitat. Bigger really does mean better, at least in terms of that in the tree world. So if you can house an oak, if you have an oak, that's super awesome, because they provide a lot of services, not only for us, but also for wildlife. There are dozens of native oak species all around Charlotte. Some of my favorites are southern red oak and the swamp white oak, because they can tolerate all different kinds of soil, sun conditions, and oaks are typically lower maintenance. They can tolerate quite a lot. We find that we have very few complaints about the oaks that we give away at our tree giveaway events. So why are oaks super great? The smaller reason a lot of people don't think about is they're actually a really good and insect-friendly tree. Insects aren't really thought about as much when you think of wildlife benefits, but they should be, because insects are the bottom of the food chain. They are so important. Oaks can house, and they're really good for over 500 species of native insects for all different reasons. The main one is they love to eat the oak leaves, and they also often nest in oaks or in the dropped leaves of oaks. So the reason I put think before you rake is because many butterfly and moth species will actually overwinter when they're in their cocoons in the leaves that have fallen off of oak trees. So of course, there are benefits to raking aesthetically and also environmentally as well. However, there are many insects and even small mammals and things like that that do take refuge in the dropped oak leaves. So that's definitely something to consider next fall. But yeah, oaks are really great for insects. So the bottom right picture might look a little scary, but it's called the orange-striped oakworm. It's a caterpillar that eats oak leaves in the fall. So they don't actually cause any harm because they eat the oak leaves in the fall when the tree is done photosynthesizing. And the main reason oaks are really great, at least for just for wildlife value, is acorns. Is probably what you thought of when you think of oak trees, but acorns are eaten by almost any native animal that you're going to see around Charlotte. Most birds, so many mammals, just absolutely love acorns. Something to keep in mind is acorns really only produce every other year, roughly, sometimes every 3 years, and the yields can be pretty unpredictable. White and red oaks, which are the two different groups of oaks that you'll see, have very different yields, which again is very unpredictable. I won't get into today. It's pretty technical and not the most interesting topic, but that is something to keep in mind as well that I recommend researching. But overall, acorns are super awesome because they're a really good quality food. We talk about trees and plants providing food for animals, but we kind of forget about how good is the food for them. Acorns are up there just because they're very high in calories, they're high in fat, protein, carbs, you know, calorically dense, which makes it a really good fall and winter food to get animals nice and full, whether they may be migrating, hibernating, things like that. Acorns are certainly the way to go. So with that, that ends what I have for you all. Below is my email, super simple, kate@treescharlotte.org. If you have any questions, of course, I'll take questions now, but if you suddenly think of something tomorrow, next week, anything, feel free to shoot me questions. I love talking about trees and I love wildlife as well. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing, get my camera back on.
This was wonderful, Kate. So thank you so much. I'm sure we have learned tons about all those trees here. And we do have a question and a comment. So there are several rusts of cedars. The one that people know best is probably cedar apple rust. Is this rust a problem in the landscape or environment?
Yeah, we do see it here sometimes. That's a good question. Yeah, we do see it here sometimes. I'm not sure what the treatment would be for that, but it is something that we do see that I would definitely recommend, though, before you do anything in terms of like a spray, anything like that, to try to send it in for like a lab sample to confirm that it is that. But if you're not sure, using any sort of hort oil, like horticultural oil, could be a good way to go as well. Just make sure you read the instructions on that, and only apply horticultural oil during tree dormancy because it can burn the leaves and stuff like that.
Thank you. That was very helpful. We have a comment from Jan Smith. She says, read the dying dogwoods. Just point of info, here in eastern North Carolina, I believe, many dogwoods died because of the flooding from Hurricane Florence. And I think she just wanted to make that pointer there. So thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'll definitely read that. It's a bummer.
Yeah, right. I know. And we have another question. Do red and white oaks produce acorns at different times?
Yeah, they do. It's so unpredictable though, but generally, this is very general. Don't quote me on this because everything I know about acorn is just like, we don't know. It's so random. But generally, white acorns are known to at least produce something every year, while red oak acorns are kind of more every other year. Also, I know white oak acorns are known to every 3 or 4 years do like a super yield where they'll do a ton of acorns at one time. I forget what the mechanism is, but also red oak acorns can sometimes survive overwintering longer than a white oak acorn. So there's benefits to that. So if there's a random late spring frost, the red acorns are known to kind of be able to survive that better because they're less mature when they start. It's a lot. It's very confusing. You could get so caught up in all that research, and then when you try to like see the patterns in person, it's just like so random. But there are kind of like general rules, but it's a whole thing. It really is. Yeah, I won't even.
No,
thank you. It's so much.
No, I think that was very helpful. We did have a comment back from DL Roy saying the cedar apple rust requires both species to live. If both trees are not present, you probably have a problem other than this rust. So thank you for that comment for the previous individual who commented here. And I'm curious, you're a community educator and you work at the tree giveaway events and a whole bunch of other things, I'm sure, but is the like demand from people for the native trees, is that growing? Have you seen more interest in that versus a lot of crepe myrtles and other species like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think people are trying to get sick of crepe myrtles, especially just because they really are everywhere, and the pruning can be tricky. For the crepe myrtles, I definitely see a lot of starting to get animosity towards them, but we do get questions all the time. Do you only give away natives, or which ones are native? Things like that. That is something that is absolutely on people's minds. There are some, like I said, situations where going with a non-native might be a little bit more beneficial. Like another thing about the Kusa dogwood, which is the non-native dogwood that we often give away, is it can tolerate full sun better, and also it's more resistant to anthracnose, which is a really common fungal disease that you'll see amongst dogwoods. It has a bit better resistance to that than the flowering dogwood. So there are some benefits, and it's a whole other game really working in urban forestry as opposed to just regular forestry, because although these trees, are adapted to the Charlotte climate, the Charlotte soil, they aren't necessarily adapted to roads and buildings and all that crazy, and soil compaction, all that crazy stuff that we're seeing when you try to plant trees in an urban environment.
Thanks, and that actually leads into one of the questions that's in the chat. Which of the native trees are best for street trees?
For street trees, you can really go in any direction. I don't know if you've been, you probably have. Queens Road West is lined with willow oaks those do well. They're all over Dilworth. Really, most oak species will be okay. The only one that I can think native tree that you should definitely avoid is really any red or silver maple. We should avoid silver maple for a whole other reason, but the red maples just tend to not do well near impervious surfaces, so near roads, driveways, things like that. That's like kind of the main one that I can really think of. You'll see red buds along the roads a lot too. I don't really see dogwoods as much along the roads, so I'd assume that red buds would be a good choice too if you're looking for something smaller.
Awesome. Thanks. That's really helpful. And a similar type of question, but a little bit different. Any recommendation for a tree planting in a very small yard?
Yeah, really any of the small maturing trees we have on our website. There are a bunch of different trees that we offer that are classified into evergreen, large, medium, small. Really any of the small maturing trees, you'll be fine. With the small maturing trees, we recommend that they're planted at least 8 feet away from a house, and at least about 5 feet away from an impervious surface. So really you'll be good with any of that. Yeah, I think that would be good. And then any tree that has more of like a columnar shape. So if you're looking for something a bit bigger, I would definitely choose something that kind of grows more like this rather than like this. So a good choice would be, if you really wanted a big tree, I don't know how small the yard is, like tulip poplars and sweet gums, which a lot of people don't like, but they actually have a lot of wildlife value too. But sweet gums, especially pines, grow more columnar, more up rather than out. Could be a good choice if you want a large tree for a small yard.
Thanks. That's awesome advice. We have a question. If trees take up pollutants in their foliage, does this affect soil biodiversity in any way? Should leaves be used as compost or amendment sparingly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, so with the natural kind of cycle, it ends up working out because yes, trees do absorb nutrients for the soil. They have a symbiotic relationship with fungus in the roots, and the fungus kind of helps the tree uptake that nutrients, and then it goes to the tree, and as the tree eventually dies, and then as the leaves fall off, it does put that nutrients back into the soil. You absolutely can use leaves as compost if you want to. That is a really great idea, in my opinion. I don't think you need to use it sparingly. I would use it as you normally would compost, but if you wanted to like throw them in with, say, food waste, things like that, you certainly absolutely can. The reason that some say, yes, you should absolutely rake up your leaves, besides the aesthetic reason, is sometimes, especially if you're close to a fresh body of water, all of that nutrients that is in the leaves can wash off and create eutrophication in bodies of water. So like get too much nutrients in the water, which is the problems that we're kind of seeing in the South and Florida, things like that. But that's mainly from feedlots, things like that. So that's kind of the main reason I heard, but that's what's so interesting kind of about what we're all into, and you know, being into the environment and nature, is there's really pros and cons for everything. Some people say rake up the leaves, it can be harmful to fresh water, things like that, with the presence of nutrients, like nutrient overload. And then some people say, no, like there are plenty of animals and insects that use the leaves for overwintering habitat. So I don't know. I wish I had all the answers. I really do, but it's tricky. It's really tricky.
Thanks, Kate. And you mentioned the non-native trees that are becoming a bit of a problem around here.
Mm-hmm.
So which of the invasives are like kind of on the top of the like hit list if you had to kind of name the ones to get rid of?
I have two. More of a problem in terms of like how they affect the native trees, I would say mimosas. They kind of have more of the feathery kind of look, and they look very tropical. They have these like puffy looking pink flowers. So I understand why some people would want them. People know not to plant them now anymore, but their seeds just blow and their pollen blows easily in the wind, but the seeds especially really just disperse all over the place and can take root anywhere. So they're out competing a lot of the native foliage that we're seeing around Charlotte, and causing quite an issue. So yes, I would say mimosa would be one of them. And the second is the Bradford Pear. I think everyone knows that one. It's the one that smells like fish. It's awful for a slew of reasons. But the main one I would say, it is very weak in bark structure. It's prone to something called included bark, which is just basically means it has weak junctures, and because of that, they can blow over easily, branches fall easily, making them quite a hazard tree, and they smell terrible, and they're just awful. So I would just not avoid the Bradford Pear if you can.
Thank you. Those were definitely two in my mind as well. I appreciate you reinforcing those.
For sure, absolutely. And we don't offer any sort of invasives at all. Everything that we do offer is on the city's approved species list. So you also know that we'll be offering trees that could also work in Charlotte too. There'll be no like palms or apple trees or anything that just like couldn't survive here either.
That is really, really good to hear. That is encouraging. But what is the future of the ash tree production and building up a population resistant to the emerald ash borer?
That's such a good question. Let me do more research about that and definitely get back to you. Right now, I know that it definitely is a problem. I think the criteria is if you have a tree with emerald ash borer, you have to assume that all trees within, I think it's like crazy, it's like a 20-30 mile radius also has that. There are treatment options, but the treatment options can be a little bit expensive, and it has to be a yearly treatment. So after a certain point, some people, you know, can't pay for that service anymore. But I'm not quite sure about, you know, the replanting of ash trees. Right now, I know through Tree Charlotte, we don't give away any ash trees. I know the city currently isn't planting any ash trees just because of that. But I'll definitely have to look at how they're handling it on a larger scale besides just, you know, going and seeing if they can treat it or removing the ash trees.
Yeah, thank you. If you find out any more info on that, if you could share that with me, I'll definitely share that with, everyone here. That's an interesting. Can you comment on the hornbeam? You have a question?
Sure. Hornbeams are great. Hornbeams are a really good option because they're medium maturing trees. So again, that may be like 30-40 foot tall range, and they're really, really shade tolerant. They can be basically grown in full shade, which is really great. They have really dense foliage as well. So they're always like looking very bushy and lots of dense foliage, and they are native, the American hornbeam is, and they have small flowers that kind of look, I'd say almost like they kind of are in these like bracts that go down. They kind of look like what I'd imagine dragon like tails to look like. But they're really great. Yeah, they're a great tree.
Great, thanks. Yeah,
I'm pro hornbeam, absolutely. We do offer those at our tree stores, and they don't get taken up that much because I just think a lot of people don't know about them. But it is a really great option for a shade tree. Works really well in naturalized areas as well. Yeah, hornbeams are awesome.
Well, you may have more people coming for those hornbeams next time.
Yeah, please do.
We all know about them. We have a comment on the Royal Polonia and it being a cute tree, but it's an invasive tree. And then we have someone commenting that Clemson offers a bounty for the Bradford pears, and there's a wanted sign in here.
Yes. Okay. I wasn't sure. I know some other cities will do actually like a buyback program. I don't think the city of Charlotte does it, but the worst.
Yeah, definitely. And we have a comment, in the long run, the treatment for the emerald ash borer can be less than taking out a tree. So that's a good comment as well.
Yeah.
Awesome. This has been wonderful. If anyone has any more pressing questions, we have our lovely tree expert here, so this is the time to ask them. You can raise your hand if you'd like to ask it out loud as well, or you can put it in the chat. But we also have Kate's email, kate@treescharlotte.org, in case someone comes up with a great question afterwards that you didn't think of in the moment, which may be the case here. But these were some great questions, and we learned a ton, Kate. So thank you so much. Is there anything else you wanted to share with us today?
I think that's it. You know, obviously we're taking a break for the summer. Trees cannot be planted here in the summer. It's just too stressful for them. But we'll be starting up again in October. If you're really into trees, we have our Tree Master training. It'll be in around mid to late September, where you can be trained to be a super volunteer and essentially help us out with our events in more of a hands-on way than just being a day of volunteer. So we're always looking for some knowledgeable tree people on our team. But I think that's it. And I really hope to see you all in the fall.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I know we have
Thank
some of
you.
our volunteers that are also tree masters as well. So
Absolutely.
I think we all have a lot in common here, and we just
Mm-hmm.
appreciate you being here tonight. So thank you so much, and appreciate everyone for joining the call.
Yes, thanks everyone.
Everyone.